Yes,
Yeah.
I suppose all of these forms, the idea that there could perhaps be across the various disciplines, strata and forms of expression, some kind of golden rule, seem to infer a oneness, a truth that in earlier forms of language may be expressed as the idea of God, wholeness, oneness. Where do you stand on the? Do you believe in God?
Well, the Jungian idea is that there's not much distinction between what Jung described as the archetype of the self and the idea of God. And the self would be something like the totality of your being across time. Jung thought of Christ as a symbol of the self. And the reason for which is a very profound idea. It's an amazingly profound idea. I mean,
Go on, unpack that a bit.
Well, you can if you think about the story of Christ from a psychological perspective, and you strip it down to its essence, what you essentially see is that the story of Christ is the ultimate tragedy. And the reason for that is that the ultimate tragedy is the worst possible thing happening to the best possible person, right? That's the ultimate tragedy. That's what makes it an archetype. You can't go past that for tragic, right? So it's an innocent man who is completely sinless, who is working on behalf of only the good and the truth, broken and destroyed, early and young, and betrayed as well. So that's the ultimate tragedy. And so then there's a comedic element to it in the technical sense, because a comedy has a happy ending.
Technically, wouldn't it require a flaw? You know, like for it to work comedically, there would need to be a flaw in Christ. Is it that he is God made flesh? Is that the flaw?
Well, it depends on what you mean by comedy. I mean, we tend to, as modern people, to think of comedy as something that's humorous, but technically, if you're looking at story structure, a comedy is just a story that has a happy ending, right? That has a positive ending. And
That's
of course,
all.
it's the resurrection story that makes Christ's story a comedy.
Ta-da!
Yeah, exactly. It's like, this went so badly wrong, but there's this possibility of resurrection. And the way that I read that psychologically, and I'm not trying to make any comments about the metaphysics of it, is that there's a part of people that's the self, the Jungian self, let's say.
The capital S self
The
of
capital
Jung.
S self, yes. That is capable of sustaining itself across successive deaths and rebirths. And everyone really understands this. It's one of the things that's most fun to teach people, because, you know, when you're moving through life and you have a plan or a dream and it shatters, you know, someone dies or a relationship breaks apart, or you have a terrible upset in your career, or you become ill in some unexpected way, then everything around you falls apart and you plunge into a chaotic underworld.
The belly of the whale.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yes, exactly that. And then maybe you stay there, because it isn't necessarily the case that people get out. You know, people die. People are in despair permanently. But frequently, something tragic and terrible befalls you, and you fall apart. And you learn something profound as a consequence, and you put yourself back together. And when you come back out, you're more than you were when you went in. And that's happening at a small scale. Every time you learn something, you know, if you ever really learn something, it's usually painful. It usually means that you have to recognize that you're wrong in some important way. You have to let that part of you that's wrong die. And then you have to let a new part of you. Okay, so the self, imagine that you undergo a series of transformations in your life. There collapses into the chaotic underworld, and then many resurrections. That happens continually, and that's what molds your character.
Yes.
The self is this thing that manages the transformations that manages all those transformations. So you could say, here's another way of thinking about it. You could identify with what you understand. That's what ideologues do. You could identify with what you don't understand, and that's what sort of seekers after truth identify with. Or you could identify with the process of moving between those states. You know, sometimes you know what you're doing, you know where you are, you're in control, and you can become arrogant and identify with that, and then become too static about it, right? Or you can be in despair and everything is chaotic, and you can identify with that, in which case you're nihilistic. Or you can view yourself as the thing that moves across the transformations. And that's the right way to conceptualize yourself, is you're the thing that maintains constancy across transformations.